Tonight we're descending into one of the darkest chapters of human history. We're going deep into the stone walls, iron chains, and suffocating darkness of medieval prisons. Forget what Hollywood has shown you. The reality was infinitely worse. Before we begin this journey into the depths, take a moment to like the video if you're enjoying the channel, and subscribe if you want more content like this. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now get comfortable, maybe dim the lights, and let's step back into a time when imprisonment meant something far more terrifying than losing your freedom. Picture yourself waking up, but not in your bed. You're lying on cold, damp stone. The air smells like death, human waste and decay. You can't see anything because there's no light, just absolute crushing darkness. Your wrists ache from iron shackles that have rubbed your skin raw. You're freezing because your clothes are soaked through from the moisture seeping from the walls, and you can hear things. Rats scurrying across the floor, someone coughing up blood in a nearby cell, the distant screams of someone being tortured. Welcome to a medieval prison, where every moment is designed to break you. Medieval imprisonment wasn't about rehabilitation or correction. Those concepts wouldn't exist for centuries. Prison in the Middle Ages served several purposes, none of them humane. Sometimes it was simply a holding cell while you waited for your trial or execution. Other times, it was punishment itself, a place where you'd rot until you paid a fine, confessed to a crime, or died from disease. And for political prisoners, enemies of the crown, or those accused of heresy, prison was often just the beginning of a much longer nightmare involving torture, interrogation, and eventually a brutal public execution. What made medieval prisons particularly terrifying was their complete disregard for human dignity or survival. There were no standards, no inspections, no rights. The jailers could do whatever they wanted. If you had money, you might survive a bit longer by bribing your way to better conditions. If you were poor, you'd be thrown into the darkest, wettest, most disease-ridden hole available and left to fade from memory. And unlike modern prisons where the goal is to keep inmates alive, medieval prisons operated on the assumption that death was often the expected outcome. The word dungeon itself comes from the French word donjon, which originally meant the Great Tower, or keep of a castle. But over time, as these towers began housing prisoners, the meaning shifted downward, literally and figuratively. The holding cells moved from relatively secure tower rooms down into the basements, sub-basements, and eventually into purpose-built underground chambers designed specifically to strip prisoners of hope. These weren't just places of confinement. They were instruments of psychological warfare, spaces engineered to destroy the human spirit before the body finally gave out. In this exploration, we're going to walk through every horrifying detail of what medieval prison was actually like. We'll examine the architecture of despair, the daily conditions that drove people mad, the diseases that swept through crowded cells like wildfire, the torture that awaited those who refused to confess, and the class system that determined whether you'd live in relative comfort or die within days. We'll look at specific prisons like the Tower of London, Newgate, and countless castle dungeons across Europe. We'll hear about the oubliettes, those nightmare shafts where prisoners were dropped and forgotten. And we'll understand why, even among all the horrors of medieval life, ending up in prison was one of the most feared fates imaginable. So take a deep breath of fresh air while you still can, because where we're going, the air is thick with the stench of human suffering and there's no escape. Medieval prisons weren't designed with rehabilitation in mind. They were designed to contain, to punish, and often to kill. The architecture itself was a weapon. Every stone wall and iron gate carefully positioned to maximize suffering and prevent escape. Let's start by understanding what these places actually looked like and why they were built the way they were. In the early medieval period, dedicated prison buildings were relatively rare. Instead, any fortified structure could serve as a prison. Castles were the primary locations, and within these massive stone fortresses several different types of holding areas emerged. The earliest prison cells were often located in the towers themselves, the highest and most secure parts of the castle. These were considered the strongest defensive positions, places where even if an enemy breached the outer walls, the prisoners would remain contained. But as castle architecture evolved and the need for prison space grew, the cells began moving downward. The transition from tower rooms to underground dungeons happened gradually over several centuries. By the 12th and 13th centuries, purpose-built prison chambers were being constructed in castle gatehouses and along the thick curtain walls. These rooms were typically small, windowless, and deliberately uncomfortable. But the real horror began when builders started creating spaces beneath ground level, carving chambers directly into the bedrock beneath castles, or digging out spaces in the foundations. Underground dungeons had several advantages from the jailer's perspective. First, they were nearly impossible to escape from. You couldn't dig through solid rock with your bare hands, and even if you somehow managed to break through a wall, you'd likely just find yourself in another sealed chamber or in the castle's foundations. Second, these spaces were naturally cold, damp, and dark. The deeper you went, the more oppressive the environment became. Moisture seeped through the walls constantly, creating a perpetual dampness that soaked into everything, from the straw on the floor to the clothes on your back to your bones themselves. The darkness was absolute. Without windows or natural light, prisoners lived in a perpetual midnight, their eyes straining uselessly in the blackness, their other senses becoming hyper-aware of every sound, smell, and sensation. The construction of these dungeons was brutally simple. Stone walls, often with no mortar, were stacked to create a chamber. The floor might be bare earth, smooth stone, or simply the exposed bedrock. There was no drainage system, so any water that seeped in stayed there, pooling on the floor and creating a permanent dampness. The ceiling was typically arched or vaulted, both for structural stability and to prevent prisoners from reaching any potential weak points. The door, if there was one, would be made of thick wooden planks bound with iron, with massive locks and bolts that could only be opened from the outside. Many dungeons didn't have doors at all. Instead, access was through a trapdoor in the ceiling, which meant prisoners had to be lowered down by rope or ladder. Once inside, there was no way to reach the opening again. You were stuck until someone decided to pull you out, assuming they ever did. This design created what we now call bottle dungeons, spaces wider at the bottom than at the top, shaped like a flask. Once you were dropped into one of these, you weren't coming out unless the authorities wanted you to. Castle dungeons varied widely in size. Some were large enough to hold dozens of prisoners in cramped, miserable conditions. Others were tiny, barely big enough for a single person to lie down. The worst were so small that you couldn't sit or lie down, forcing you to stand for days, weeks, or even months until your legs gave out and you collapsed. These were often located in towers, and they served a specific purpose: to break a prisoner's will as quickly as possible through sheer physical exhaustion and pain. The Tower of London, perhaps the most famous prison in medieval Europe, exemplifies the range of prison conditions that could exist within a single complex. The tower wasn't built as a prison originally. William the Conqueror constructed it as a royal fortress and residence starting in the 1070s, but by the 1200s, parts of it were being used to hold prisoners, and over the following centuries it became England's premier state prison. The tower contained multiple types of holding areas. High-ranking prisoners, particularly those of noble birth, might be housed in relatively comfortable tower rooms. They'd have beds, furniture, sometimes even servants, and could move about within their chambers. But lower down, in the basements and sub-levels, conditions deteriorated dramatically. There were dark cells with no light, tiny chambers designed to induce claustrophobia, and spaces so cold and damp that prisoners regularly developed pneumonia and other respiratory diseases. One of the most notorious areas was the room beneath the White Tower, the original keep. This basement level contained cells where prisoners could be chained to the walls in various uncomfortable positions. The walls themselves were thick, sometimes 15 feet or more, which meant that even if you screamed as loudly as you could, no one outside would hear you. The tower also had a torture chamber, though the English were somewhat less enthusiastic about torture than some of their continental counterparts. But when interrogation was deemed necessary, the instruments were there: the rack, the scavenger's daughter, and various other devices designed to extract confessions through pain. Newgate Prison in London tells a different but equally grim story. Originally one of the gates in the Roman wall surrounding the city, it began functioning as a prison in the late 1100s. King Henry II, as part of his legal reforms, required that accused criminals be held somewhere while awaiting trial. Newgate was established for exactly this purpose. Unlike the Tower, which held primarily political prisoners and high-value captives, Newgate was for common criminals, thieves, murderers, debtors, and anyone else who fell afoul of the law. The early Newgate was small and quickly became overcrowded. By the 1300s, it was notorious for its appalling conditions. Prisoners were crammed into cells with no regard for space or comfort. The air was so foul that visitors complained they could smell the prison from blocks away. Disease was rampant. In 1414, the prison keeper and 64 prisoners died of jail fever, the medieval term for typhus. The death toll was so catastrophic that wealthy Londoner Richard Whittington, who served as Lord Mayor, left money in his will to completely rebuild the prison. The new Newgate, completed in 1432, was larger and slightly better ventilated, but it remained a nightmare. The design of Newgate reflected the medieval attitude toward prisoners. There were separate areas for men and women, though both suffered equally miserable conditions. The prison was divided into different sections based on ability to pay. The wealthy could purchase space in the master's side, where you'd have a bed, some furniture, and relatively better conditions. The poor went to the common side, where dozens of people might be crammed into a single room with no furniture, no beds, just filthy straw on a stone floor. And then there was the press yard, a separate section for special cases, though special didn't mean better. It often meant prisoners who were being subjected to particular legal procedures or punishments. Across Europe, similar patterns emerged. French castles contained oubliettes, which we'll discuss in detail later, spaces specifically designed to hold someone indefinitely, in the most oppressive conditions imaginable. German castles featured deep dungeons cut directly into the rock beneath the fortress. Italian prisons, particularly those associated with the Inquisition, were designed with psychological torture in mind. Rooms were windowless and sometimes constructed with unusual acoustics, so that screams would echo endlessly within the chamber but couldn't be heard outside. The walls might be shaped to reflect sound back at the prisoner, amplifying their own cries of distress and creating an unbearable auditory nightmare. Prison architecture also included various restraint systems built directly into the structure. Walls had iron rings embedded in the stone, positioned at specific heights and intervals. These rings served multiple purposes. A prisoner could be chained to the wall in a standing position, forced to remain upright for days, or the chains could be adjusted to force them to sit or kneel in painful positions. Some rings were placed high on the wall, requiring the prisoner to stand on their toes or hang partially suspended, their full weight supported by their wrists. This created excruciating pain in the shoulders and arms, while also making it nearly impossible to sleep or rest. The floors of many dungeons featured additional restraint systems. Iron bars or wooden stocks could be locked around a prisoner's ankles, securing them in place. Some floors had channels carved into the stone, designed to allow waste and water to flow out, but these rarely worked properly and instead just created permanent puddles of filth. Other floors were deliberately left rough and uneven, with sharp stones and edges that made sitting or lying down painful. Ventilation in medieval prisons ranged from poor to non-existent. Some cells had small openings near the ceiling, little more than slits in the stone, which provided minimal air circulation. But many underground dungeons had no ventilation at all. The air became thick and stale, heavy with moisture and the smell of human waste. Prisoners would sometimes pass out from lack of oxygen, only to wake up still trapped in the same airless hell. The stagnant air also meant that diseases spread incredibly rapidly. A single person with typhus or plague could infect an entire cell block within days. The only light in most dungeons came from torches or candles, and prisoners certainly weren't given these luxuries. Jailers might bring a torch when delivering food or checking on prisoners, but otherwise you lived in total darkness. Your eyes would adjust slightly over time, able to pick up the faintest variations in shadow, but you'd never truly see again until you were released or dragged out for trial or execution. This constant darkness had profound psychological effects. Without the day-night cycle, prisoners lost all sense of time. Days and nights blended together into an endless now. Some prisoners went mad from the darkness alone. Long before disease or malnutrition killed them, temperature control was impossible. In Cis winter, dungeons became freezing. The stone walls and floors held the cold, and without any source of heat, prisoners would shiver uncontrollably. Hypothermia was a real threat, and many prisoners died simply from exposure. The dampness made the cold even worse, as wet clothes and wet stones sucked the warmth from your body. In summer, dungeons could become sweltering, particularly those above ground. With no air circulation, the heat became oppressive, and the smell grew even worse as organic material decomposed faster in the warmth. Some castles featured especially creative prison designs. The Little Ease was a cell so small that you couldn't stand up, sit down, or lie down comfortably. You could only crouch in an agonizing position, unable to stretch or move. Being confined in a Little Ease for even a few hours was torture. Days or weeks would leave permanent damage to your joints and spine. Other castles had cells with sloped or tilted floors, making it impossible to stand or sit comfortably. Your body would constantly be fighting against the angle, creating persistent muscle fatigue and pain. Water sometimes played a role in prison design, but not in a helpful way. Some dungeons had channels of water running through them, usually contaminated wastewater or runoff from higher levels of the castle. Prisoners had to sit or stand in this water, leading to infections and skin conditions. A few especially cruel designs featured cells that would partially flood during heavy rains, forcing prisoners to stand in water up to their knees or waist, unable to sleep without drowning. In coastal fortifications, some dungeons were positioned so that seawater would flood them during high tide, another form of periodic torture. The Bastille in Paris, built in the late 1300s, became infamous for its prison conditions. Originally a fortress protecting the eastern entrance to the city, it was later converted primarily into a state prison for enemies of the crown. The Bastille had 8 towers, each of which could hold prisoners. Unlike some medieval prisons, the Bastille featured individual cells rather than large communal rooms. This might sound better, but individual cells meant complete isolation. Prisoners went months or years without seeing another human face, except for brief visits from jailers. The isolation drove many prisoners to insanity. The Bastille also had underground dungeons below the tower cells, dark pits where the most troublesome or despised prisoners were kept. Castle dungeons across Scotland were particularly brutal. The climate itself was an enemy. Scottish winters brought bitter cold and constant dampness. Many Scottish castles were built near water, on coastal cliffs or riverbanks, which meant the dungeons were perpetually damp from water seeping through the foundation stones. Dunnottar Castle, Stirling Castle, and Edinburgh Castle all contained dungeons where prisoners suffered in dark, wet cells carved from solid rock. At Edinburgh Castle, the prison vaults held French prisoners during various conflicts, and the conditions were so terrible that many prisoners carved desperate messages into the walls before dying. Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire earned a reputation as having some of the most horrific dungeons in England. These dungeons were so notorious that Shakespeare referenced them in his play Richard III. The Earl Rivers, facing execution at Pontefract, calls it a bloody prison. The dungeons there were deep underground, accessed through trapdoors, and prisoners lowered into them knew they'd likely never see daylight again. The darkness, dampness and isolation were so extreme that merely being sent to Pontefract was often considered a death sentence, even without formal execution. Some prisons combined castle dungeons with other architectural elements to maximise security and suffering. For example, a castle might have a well or cistern in its courtyard, and prison cells could be built around or beneath it. This meant prisoners were constantly surrounded by the sound of water, but had no access to it, a form of psychological torture. Or cells might be built along corridors where guards walked regularly, so prisoners could hear the footsteps of freedom walking past, knowing they couldn't reach it. The architecture of medieval prisons wasn't accidental. Every element, from the thick walls to the iron rings to the narrow doors, was designed with specific purposes. These structures were meant to contain, to punish, to interrogate, and often to kill. They were machines of suffering built from stone and iron, and stepping into one meant entering a space where human dignity and mercy had no place. If the architecture of medieval prisons was designed to break your spirit, the daily conditions inside were designed to destroy your body. Let's examine what an actual day, if you can call the endless darkness interrupted by brief moments of torchlight a day, looked like for a medieval prisoner. You wake up, though waking implies you are actually able to sleep. Most nights in a medieval dungeon don't involve sleep in any meaningful sense. You drift in and out of consciousness, too cold and uncomfortable to truly rest, startled awake by rats running across your body or by the cries of other prisoners. Your back aches because you've been lying on bare stone or packed earth. If there's straw, it's old and filthy, probably infested with lice and fleas, providing no real cushioning. You might have a thin blanket if you're lucky, but it's likely as damp as everything else in this place, offering little warmth. The cold is the first thing you notice every time you regain consciousness. Medieval dungeons were always cold. In winter, the temperature could drop to near freezing, and without any source of heat, your body fought a constant battle against hypothermia. Stone is an excellent conductor of cold, and lying on it would drain your body heat relentlessly. You'd curl into a ball trying to preserve warmth, but it never quite worked. Your hands and feet would go numb, your joints would ache. Sometimes you'd wake up and not be able to move your fingers properly because they'd become so stiff from the cold. In summer, the cold lessened but was replaced by stifling heat in above-ground cells, or a clammy warmth in underground ones that somehow felt even worse than the winter chill. The humidity would be oppressive, the air so thick and heavy that every breath felt like inhaling water. Sweat would pour off you, soaking your already damp clothes, creating a constant state of wetness that led to skin problems, infections, and a persistent feeling of being slowly dissolved by moisture. The darkness is absolute. Unless a jailer has recently come by with a torch, you can't see anything. You wave your hand in front of your face and see nothing. Your eyes strain uselessly, trying to find any source of light, any variation in the blackness, but there's nothing. This darkness does things to your mind. Without visual input, your brain starts creating its own. You begin to see shadows that aren't there, movements in the corner of your vision that vanish when you try to look directly at them. Some prisoners report seeing lights or shapes floating in the darkness, hallucinations born from sensory deprivation. Others lose the ability to judge space and distance. When a light finally appears, your eyes hurt from the sudden brightness, and it takes several long moments before you can see properly again. The smell is overwhelming and inescapable. It's a mixture of human waste, rotting organic matter, mould, stagnant water, and disease. Medieval prisons had no sanitation systems, no toilets, no latrines, no waste removal. If you needed to relieve yourself, you did it wherever you were. Sometimes there might be a bucket in the corner, emptied occasionally by a jailer if you were fortunate. More often, There was just a designated corner of the cell where everyone went, or you simply went where you stood. The waste accumulated. In winter it might freeze, which at least temporarily stopped the smell. In summer it decomposed, creating a stench so powerful it would make you gag every time you breathed. But you couldn't stop breathing, and eventually your nose would adjust, or rather, it would become so overwhelmed by the smell that it stopped properly registering it. But the smell was still there, clinging to your clothes, your skin, your hair. It became part of you, and mixed with the waste was the smell of unwashed bodies. Medieval people didn't bathe frequently to begin with, but in prison, washing was impossible. You wore the same clothes day after day, week after week. Sweat, dirt and grime built up in layers. Your hair became matted and greasy. Your skin developed a coating of filth that never went away. The dampness saturated everything. Water seeped through the stone walls constantly, sometimes invisible. Trickles, other times just as a general moisture that made the air feel heavy. The floor was usually wet, puddles forming in any low spots. If there was straw, it became sodden and began to rot, adding another layer to the smell. Your clothes were always damp, which made the cold even more piercing. Damp clothes against your skin would lead to chafing, rashes, and eventually open sores that wouldn't heal in the unsanitary conditions. The sounds of a medieval prison created their own form of torture. In the darkness, your hearing became hyper-aware. You'd hear water dripping, a constant plink, plink, plink that could drive you mad with its regularity. You'd hear rats squeaking and scurrying. Medieval prisons were overrun with rodents. They'd crawl over you at night, searching for any scrap of food, sometimes even nibbling at exposed skin. You'd hear the chains of other prisoners rattling when they moved. You'd hear coughing, endless coughing from people sick with plague or typhus or tuberculosis. You'd hear moaning from those in pain. You'd hear crying from those who'd broken down. Sometimes you'd hear screaming, either from someone being tortured elsewhere in the prison, or from someone who'd finally lost their mind. The sounds would echo in the stone chambers, making it impossible to judge distance. A scream that sounded close might be from several rooms away, or it might be right next door. The echo would also amplify every noise you made. Your own breathing would sound loud in your ears. If you spoke, your voice would bounce off the walls, coming back to you slightly distorted. Many prisoners stopped speaking entirely, unable to bear the sound of their own voice in that place. Physical discomfort was constant and multi-layered. If you were chained, the iron shackles would rub against your wrists or ankles with every movement, gradually wearing away the skin. The shackles were usually made with sharp edges or rough surfaces, deliberately designed to cause discomfort. They'd be heavy, perhaps 20 or 30 pounds of iron locked around your limbs, creating a constant drag on your movements. The chains would be long enough to allow some movement, but not enough to be truly comfortable. You couldn't stretch out fully. You couldn't move more than a few feet from wherever the chain was anchored to the wall. The lack of proper rest meant your body couldn't recover from the daily strain. You'd develop pressure sores from lying in the same positions. Your muscles would atrophy from lack of movement. Your joints would stiffen. If you were kept in a cramped space or forced to maintain an uncomfortable position, you'd develop permanent damage. Prisoners kept standing for days would find their legs swelling grotesquely. Those kept in tiny cells would emerge with hunchbacks and twisted spines that would never straighten again. Hunger was a constant companion. We'll discuss food in detail in the next section, but the daily reality was that you were always hungry. The portions provided, if any food was provided at all, were never enough. Your stomach would cramp from emptiness. You'd become lightheaded and weak. Over time, your body would begin consuming itself, burning muscle for energy since there was no fat left. Your ribs would become visible. Your face would become gaunt, skull-like. Your body would slow down all non-essential functions to conserve energy, leaving you feeling cold and sluggish. The lack of sunlight had profound effects on your health. Without exposure to the sun, your body couldn't produce vitamin D. This led to weakened bones, a condition we now call rickets. Prisoners would develop pain in their bones and joints. Their teeth would loosen, their muscles would weaken even further. The absence of natural light also disrupted sleep patterns and circadian rhythms, contributing to the feeling of existing in a timeless void. Insects were everywhere. Lice lived in your clothes and hair, biting constantly, causing intense itching. You'd scratch until you bled, but the lice would just keep multiplying. Fleas hopped from person to person in communal cells, spreading rapidly. These weren't just annoying, they carried diseases like typhus and plague. Bedbugs, if there were any surfaces to hide in, would emerge at night to feed. In summer, flies would swarm over any organic matter, landing on wounds and waste indiscriminately. Mosquitoes would breed in any standing water, adding malaria to the list of potential diseases. For prisoners kept in communal cells, the proximity to other suffering humans added another layer of horror. You'd be packed in with dozens of other people in a space designed for far fewer. Personal space didn't exist. You'd be pressed against other bodies, feeling their sweat, their trembling from fever, their convulsions from disease. If someone died, which happened frequently, their body wouldn't be removed immediately. You might spend hours or days next to a corpse, waiting for a jailer to notice and care enough to drag it out. Sometimes bodies weren't removed at all, they were just pushed to a corner where they decomposed slowly. The lack of privacy was absolute. You'd perform all bodily functions in full view of others. If you were sick and vomiting, everyone would hear and see it. If you developed dysentery, everyone would know. If you broke down and cried or screamed, it would happen in front of an audience of fellow sufferers who were too exhausted or broken to care. There was no dignity, no modesty, no privacy of any kind. Thirst was often worse than hunger. Prisoners were sometimes given water, but it was usually contaminated. The water might come from a well that also served as a dumping site for waste. It might be drawn from a river downstream from where sewage was deposited. Drinking it could make you violently ill, but not drinking it meant dying of dehydration, so you drank it anyway and hoped your body could handle whatever parasites or bacteria it contained. The psychological effects of these daily conditions were devastating. The combination of darkness, isolation or overcrowding, physical discomfort, hunger, cold, and the omnipresent smell of death and decay would break most people within weeks. Some prisoners became catatonic, retreating so deep into their own minds that they stopped responding to external stimuli. Others became violent, lashing out at anyone within reach. Many simply gave up, lying down and waiting to die, refusing food or water, their will to survive completely exhausted. Hallucinations were common. Sensory deprivation combined with malnutrition and disease would cause prisoners to see and hear things that weren't there. Some prisoners reported conversations with people who weren't present, or seeing elaborate visions of escape or rescue. These hallucinations could be vivid and convincing, making it hard for prisoners to distinguish reality from delusion. The loss of time was particularly disorienting. In the absolute darkness, without any markers of day or night, prisoners would lose track of how long they'd been imprisoned. A week could feel like a month could feel like a year. When asked how long they'd been held, many prisoners couldn't answer. Time had become meaningless in that dark space where nothing changed except the slow deterioration of their own bodies. For prisoners who could see other cells or corridors, watching other prisoners be led away for execution added a psychological burden. You'd see someone dragged out, knowing they were going to their death, and wonder when your turn would come. Or you'd see new prisoners brought in, fresh-faced and terrified, and remember what you'd been like when you first arrived, before the prison had hollowed you out. The daily routine, such as it was, consisted mostly of waiting for food that might not come, waiting for water, waiting for news of your trial or sentence, waiting for disease to take you, or for the authorities to decide your fate, waiting in the dark, in the cold, in the stench, in the pain. The waiting stretched on endlessly, each moment indistinguishable from the last, until the only thing you were really waiting for was death. let's talk about what prisoners ate in medieval times, or more accurately, let's talk about how they starved. Food in medieval prisons wasn't about sustenance or maintaining health. It was a weapon, a form of control, and sometimes a method of execution through slow starvation. The basic truth of medieval imprisonment is this: unless you had money, you weren't getting fed properly. The medieval justice system operated on the assumption that prisoners or their families should pay for their own imprisonment. The jailers weren't running a charity. They were usually private individuals who'd purchased or been granted the right to run a prison, and they made their living by charging prisoners for everything. Food was the most important commodity, and it came at a price. If you had coin, you could arrange for meals to be brought in from outside. Your family might send food, or you could pay the jailer to purchase items for you. Wealthy prisoners in places like the Tower of London or Newgate's Master's Side could sometimes arrange for quite decent meals. There are records of noble prisoners dining on meat, bread, cheese, ale, and even wine. They might have multiple courses, proper plates, and servants to prepare and serve their food. But this was the tiny minority, the aristocratic prisoners whose imprisonment was more political house arrest than actual punishment. For everyone else, food was scarce, irregular, and barely adequate to sustain life. The standard prison diet, when food was provided at all, consisted primarily of bread and water, not fresh, soft bread, not the wheaten bread that the wealthy ate. Prison bread was made from the cheapest possible flour, often containing adulterants to bulk it up. Rye flour mixed with barley, sometimes with ground acorns or sawdust added to make it stretch further. The bread would be days or weeks old, hard enough to break teeth, often mouldy. A prisoner might receive 8 to 10 ounces of this bread per day, sometimes less. The bread was usually delivered every few days rather than daily. You'd get several days' worth at once, and you'd need to make it last because the next delivery might be late or might not come at all if the jailer forgot, or didn't feel like making the rounds. The problem with storing bread in a damp dungeon was that it would become even mouldier and would attract rats and insects. You'd wake up to find rats had eaten half your bread ration, leaving you with even less to survive on. Water, when provided, was often contaminated. Medieval people understood that drinking from certain sources made you sick, which is why they generally preferred weak ale or beer. The brewing process, which involved boiling the water, killed many of the harmful organisms. But prisoners rarely got ale. They got water, drawn from whatever source was convenient, which might be a well also used for disposing of waste, or a river downstream from the city's sewage. Prisoners would drink it because they had no choice, and many would promptly develop dysentery, typhoid, or other waterborne diseases. Some prisons provided a thin gruel or porridge. This might be made from oatmeal, barley, or other cheap grains, boiled in water to create a watery, tasteless mush. If you were fortunate, the gruel might contain a few bits of vegetable, perhaps some turnip or leek. More often, it was just grain and water, barely enough to keep you alive. A pint of gruel might be provided once per day, or every other day. It was rarely enough to satisfy hunger, and its nutritional value was minimal. On certain days, particularly for prisoners sentenced to hard labour, who needed to maintain some level of physical strength, there might be additional food. A small piece of meat, perhaps 3 ounces of cooked mutton or beef, though the quality was always the lowest grade imaginable. Gristly, fatty cuts that had been sitting around too long, or there might be a potato or two, boiled and unseasoned. Some prisons provided cheese occasionally, 2 or 3 ounces of hard, probably rancid cheese that added some protein to the diet, but was never enough to prevent malnutrition. The complete absence of fresh fruits or vegetables meant that prisoners rapidly developed scurvy. Your gums would begin to bleed, your teeth would loosen and fall out, old wounds would reopen, you'd develop painful sores that wouldn't heal. The fatigue from scurvy would compound the weakness from general malnutrition, leaving you barely able to move. But many prisoners received even less than this minimal ration. If you couldn't pay for food and had no family to send provisions, you might receive nothing at all. The authorities' attitude was that starving was your own fault for being poor. Some prisoners attempted to eat anything they could find. Historical accounts describe desperate prisoners eating the straw from their bedding, gnawing on leather belts or shoes, or trying to catch and eat rats. The rats were often more successful at catching the prisoners' food than the prisoners were at catching the rats. Starvation was also used as a deliberate punishment. A prisoner who misbehaved, who refused to confess, or who annoyed the jailers might have their already meagre rations cut further or eliminated entirely for days at a time. This wasn't just meant to punish, it was meant to break resistance. A starving person becomes desperate, willing to confess to anything, agree to anything just for the promise of food. The concept of the hunger tower took deliberate starvation to its logical extreme. These were special prison chambers, sometimes located in castle towers, where prisoners were sealed in with no food or water and left to die slowly. The hunger tower wasn't meant to extract confessions or serve justice. It was meant to eliminate someone while technically avoiding the formality of execution. Noble prisoners who couldn't be openly executed for political reasons might be placed in a hunger tower. Religious prisoners, particularly during periods of intense persecution, might be starved to death rather than given the martyr's death of public execution. The psychological effects of starvation compounded the physical ones. As your body broke down muscle for energy, your brain function would deteriorate. You'd have trouble thinking clearly, remembering things or making decisions. Your mood would swing wildly between apathy and irritability. Hallucinations would become more common and more vivid. Some prisoners became obsessed with food, spending hours describing imaginary meals in exhaustive detail, torturing themselves with memories of feasts they'd attended or meals they'd eaten. The cruel irony was that even if food arrived, your weakened body might not be able to handle it. Prisoners who'd been starving for weeks or months and were suddenly given a proper meal would sometimes die from refeeding syndrome. Their bodies, adapted to starvation, couldn't process the sudden influx of nutrients. They'd become violently ill, their hearts would fail, and they'd die with food in their stomachs after surviving weeks of hunger. For prisoners with families on the outside, the food situation could be slightly better, but it created its own problems. Families who wanted to keep their imprisoned relatives alive had to bring food to the prison regularly. This meant someone had to travel to the prison, which might be far from where they lived, carrying food that wouldn't spoil during the journey. The jailers would usually take a cut, confiscating part of whatever was brought before passing the rest to the prisoner. And there was no guarantee that what your family sent would actually reach you. Corrupt jailers might simply keep the food for themselves and tell the prisoner that nothing had been delivered, or claim that the food had spoiled. Communal cells created additional food problems. If food was delivered to a cell holding multiple prisoners, there was always conflict over how to divide it. The strongest prisoners would take more than their share. The weak and sick would get less. This created a brutal hierarchy within prison cells, where those with any remaining physical strength would dominate food distribution. Elderly prisoners, children, or anyone too weak to fight for their share would starve faster than the rest. Some prisoners attempted to supplement their diets by trading with jailers or other prisoners. You might trade your blanket for an extra portion of bread, accepting that you'd freeze at night, but at least you wouldn't starve today. Or you might trade information, promises, or anything else you had of value. Sexual favours were sometimes traded for food, particularly among female prisoners, creating another level of exploitation within an already horrific situation. The timing of food delivery was erratic and unpredictable. You might receive your bread ration in the morning one day, in the evening the next, or not at all for several days. This unpredictability made it impossible to ration your food effectively. Do you eat everything now because you might not get another meal for days, or do you save some, risking that rats will steal it, or that it will become inedible? Water deprivation was sometimes used alongside food deprivation. A prisoner might be given food but no water, forcing them to eat dry bread that would stick in their throat and sit like a rock in their stomach. Or they might be given water but no food, allowing them to stay hydrated while still starving. The combination of hunger and thirst would drive prisoners to desperation faster than either alone. Religious fasting added another dimension to prison starvation. The medieval church required fasting on certain days, particularly during Lent. Prison authorities would sometimes use these religious requirements to justify reducing rations even further. On fast days, prisoners who were already receiving minimal food might receive nothing at all, with the justification that everyone was supposed to fast on those days. The fact that healthy people fasting could break their fast at the end of the day while prisoners could not was conveniently ignored. For prisoners awaiting execution, the final meal tradition that would later become standard didn't really exist in medieval times. You weren't given a special last meal. If anything, the opposite might happen. Why waste food on someone who's going to die tomorrow? Some condemned prisoners were deliberately starved in their final days, either as additional punishment or simply because feeding them was seen as pointless. The long-term effects of prison starvation on those who did survive and were eventually released were devastating. People emerged from prison emaciated, their bodies permanently damaged. They'd lost teeth, developed digestive problems that would last the rest of their lives, suffered bone damage from nutritional deficiencies, and experienced cognitive impairment from prolonged malnutrition. Many former prisoners never fully recovered their health, dying within a year or two of release from complications of their imprisonment. If the hunger didn't kill you, the disease almost certainly would. Medieval prisons were perfect incubators for every illness imaginable, and once disease took hold in those dark, damp, overcrowded cells, it spread like wildfire through the population of prisoners. Let's examine the diseases that turned prisons into death houses, and why survival past a few months was almost miraculous. Jail fever, now known as typhus, was the signature disease of medieval prisons. The name itself, jail fever, shows how strongly it was associated with imprisonment. Typhus is caused by bacteria spread by body lice, and medieval prisons provided ideal conditions for both lice and typhus to thrive. Every prisoner had lice, there was no avoiding them. The insects lived in the seams of your clothing, breeding rapidly in the warmth of your body, biting constantly to feed on your blood. Typhus bacteria live in the lice. When an infected louse bites you and you scratch the bite, you rub the louse's feces into the wound, introducing the bacteria into your bloodstream. The disease incubates for 1 to 2 weeks, and then the symptoms hit hard. Fever spikes suddenly, reaching dangerous levels. Headaches become intense, pounding pain that won't stop. You develop a rash of red spots across your chest, arms, and back. As the disease progresses, you become delirious, unable to think clearly or recognize where you are. In severe cases, gangrene sets in at your extremities, your fingers and toes turning black as the tissue dies. Without modern antibiotics, typhus had a mortality rate of 40 to 60%. That meant in any outbreak, nearly half the prisoners would die. But the death toll in prisons was often higher because the victims were already weakened by malnutrition, cold, and other diseases. And once typhus got started in a prison, it didn't stop. The lice would move from body to body, from the sick to the healthy, spreading the infection until nearly everyone in the prison had been exposed. The 1414 outbreak at Newgate Prison shows how devastating jail fever could be. The prison keeper and 64 prisoners died in a single outbreak. This wasn't unusual. Historical records from across Europe show similar death tolls whenever typhus swept through a prison. In 1550, during a session at the Old Bailey courthouse next to Newgate, typhus spread from the prisoners to the judges, lawyers and spectators in the courtroom. The Lord Mayor of London died, along with numerous court officials. After that, special precautions were taken. Judges wouldn't enter the prison itself, and prisoners were brought to court through special passages designed to minimise contact. But typhus wasn't the only killer. Plague, the Black Death, found fertile ground in medieval prisons. Plague is spread by fleas, typically fleas that live on rats, and medieval prisons were overrun with rats. The rodents lived in the walls, nested in the straw, and moved freely through the cells. When plague-infected fleas bit prisoners, the bacteria Yersinia pestis entered their bloodstream, and death usually followed within days. Bubonic plague caused swellings in the lymph nodes, called buboes, typically in the groin or armpits. These swellings could grow to the size of an apple, painful and hot to the touch. The victim would develop fever, chills, and extreme weakness. If the infection spread to the bloodstream causing septicemic plague, death came even faster. And if it reached the lungs, causing pneumonic plague, it became airborne and could spread directly from person to person through coughing. Pneumonic plague had a mortality rate near 100% before modern medicine. When plague entered a prison, the authorities' response was often to simply seal the facility and let everyone inside die. Better to lose a few dozen or 100 prisoners than risk the disease spreading to the city. Prison staff might flee, leaving the prisoners locked in with the dead and dying, with no food or water, waiting for either the plague or starvation to finish them off. Some cities would eventually send in crews to remove the bodies and burn them, but often they'd wait until they were sure everyone inside was dead. Dysentery was another constant killer. The unsanitary conditions, contaminated water, and lack of hygiene meant that intestinal diseases spread rapidly. Dysentery caused severe diarrhea, often bloody, along with cramping pain and fever. Victims would rapidly dehydrate, their bodies unable to retain fluids. In a prison with no clean water and no medical care, dysentery was frequently fatal. The disease would tear through a cell, infecting everyone, leaving the floor covered in waste and the air thick with the stench of death. Tuberculosis thrived in the close quarters and poor ventilation of prisons. The disease spread through the air when infected prisoners coughed. You'd inhale the bacteria deep into your lungs where it would establish an infection. TB caused a chronic cough that brought up blood, weight loss even beyond the normal prison starvation, night sweats, and progressive weakness. The disease could take months or years to kill, during which time the victim would infect numerous other prisoners. TB was particularly common in underground dungeons with no fresh air circulation. Pneumonia, caused by bacterial or viral infections of the lungs, was extremely common in the cold, damp conditions. Prisoners already weakened by malnutrition had compromised immune systems that couldn't fight off respiratory infections. The constant dampness meant prisoners' clothes were always wet, and wet clothes against cold skin was a recipe for pneumonia. The disease would cause fever, difficulty breathing, and a productive cough. Without antibiotics, bacterial pneumonia killed more than 30% of its victims, and in medieval prisons the death rate was likely much higher. Skin infections were ubiquitous. The constant dampness caused the skin to break down. The filth meant any small cut or scrape would become infected. Prisoners would develop abscesses, boils, and ulcers that grew larger and more painful over time. If bacteria entered the bloodstream through these wounds, sepsis would develop, a deadly systemic infection that caused fever, rapid heartbeat, and organ failure. Scabies, caused by tiny mites burrowing under the skin, created intense itching and rashes. The mites spread easily through physical contact, which was unavoidable in crowded cells. Prisoners would scratch themselves raw, creating open wounds that would become infected. The itching was maddening, constant, never-ending, adding psychological torture to the physical suffering. Fungal infections flourished in the damp environment. Feet would develop persistent athlete's foot that made walking painful. Fungal infections of the groin and other skin folds would cause itching, raw patches, and a distinctive sour smell. These infections weren't usually fatal, but they added to the misery and could worsen into more serious bacterial infections. Eye infections were common, particularly in the dark conditions where prisoners would rub their eyes frequently. Trachoma, a bacterial infection that could cause blindness, spread through shared contaminated water and close contact. Prisoners who entered the facility with good vision might emerge months later partially or completely blind. Malnutrition itself qualified as a disease condition. Beyond simple hunger, prolonged lack of proper nutrition caused specific deficiency diseases. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C caused gums to bleed and teeth to fall out. Pellagra from niacin deficiency caused skin problems, diarrhea, and eventually dementia. Beriberi from thiamine deficiency caused nerve damage and heart problems. Rickets from lack of vitamin D caused bone pain and deformities. Prisoners developed all of these simultaneously, their bodies slowly breaking down from multiple nutritional deficiencies. Mental illness, while not infectious in the traditional sense, spread through prisons like a contagion. The stress, isolation, darkness and hopelessness broke minds as surely as disease broke bodies. Prisoners would develop what we'd now call depression, anxiety disorders, PTSD and psychosis. They'd rock back and forth for hours, muttering to themselves. They'd suddenly lash out in violence at nothing. They'd withdraw completely, becoming catatonic. The symptoms would worsen over time, and there was no treatment, no therapy, no relief. The disease burden meant that death was omnipresent in medieval prisons. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be removed. When a prisoner died, their body might lie in the cell for days before anyone bothered to drag it out. The other prisoners would be forced to sleep next to corpses, breathing in the smell of decomposition, trying to ignore the sight of decay happening before their eyes. Dead bodies weren't treated with any respect or dignity. They'd be dragged out of cells by the ankles and dumped in a cart. Multiple bodies would be piled together. They might be taken for burial in a mass grave, or during times of epidemic they might simply be burned in a pit outside the prison. No prayers, no ceremony, no marker to show that a human being had existed and died there. The disease environment was so bad that even prison staff were at risk. Jailers who entered cells regularly would sometimes contract typhus or plague and die. Priests who came to give last rites to condemned prisoners would fall ill and die themselves. Judges and lawyers tried to minimize their exposure to prisoners, which is why courts were built adjacent to prisons rather than inside them, and why special arrangements were made to bring prisoners to court while minimizing contact. Occasionally authorities would recognize that conditions had become so terrible that the prison itself was a health hazard. They might order a prison temporarily closed and fumigated, usually by burning sulfur or herbs inside to try to kill the disease. But this was rare and usually happened only after a significant outbreak had already killed many prisoners and started spreading to the surrounding community. The medieval medical understanding of disease was limited and often counterproductive. Doctors believed in the theory of humours, that illness was caused by imbalances of bodily fluids. Treatment might involve bloodletting, which would further weaken an already malnourished prisoner, or they might prescribe various herbs and concoctions that had no real medicinal value. The concept of germs and bacteria wouldn't be discovered for centuries, so there was no understanding of how diseases actually spread or how to prevent infection. Some prisoners seemed to be more resistant to disease than others, but this was likely due to prior exposure and acquired immunity rather than any inherent strength. If you'd survived typhus once, you'd be immune to it in the future. If you'd been exposed to certain diseases as a child, you might have some resistance as an adult. But eventually, in the disease-ridden environment of a medieval prison, something would kill you. It was just a matter of which disease got to you first. Medieval society was rigidly stratified by class, and this hierarchy didn't stop at the prison door. Your treatment in a medieval prison depended almost entirely on your social status, and, related to that, how much money you had. The experience of a noble prisoner in the Tower of London bore almost no resemblance to the experience of a common thief in Newgate's common side, even though both were technically imprisoned. Let's start with noble prisoners, those of aristocratic birth or high political standing. When a nobleman was imprisoned, it was usually for political reasons rather than common crime. Perhaps they'd supported the wrong faction in a power struggle, or they'd fallen out of favour with the king, or they'd been on the losing side of a rebellion. Their imprisonment was often less about punishment, and more about keeping them contained while political situations resolved. Noble prisoners lived in relative luxury, at least compared to everyone else in the facility. They might be housed in tower rooms with windows, furniture, and even tapestries on the walls. They'd have beds with proper mattresses and blankets. They could bring servants with them, or hire servants from outside to attend to their needs. They'd be allowed visitors, sometimes extensively, with friends and family coming and going with relative freedom. Some noble prisoners essentially held court from their cells, receiving petitioners and conducting business. The food for noble prisoners was entirely different from what common prisoners received. They could pay for meals to be brought in from outside, sometimes from taverns or even from their own estates if those were nearby. They'd dine on meat, fish, fresh bread, vegetables, and wine. Multiple courses were common. Some noble prisoners gained weight during their imprisonment because they ate better than they had when free, simply from boredom and the availability of good food. Noble prisoners could also purchase better living conditions in other ways. They could pay for additional rooms for heating in winter, for candles and oil lamps to provide light. They could have books brought in, musical instruments, writing materials. Some continued their education or artistic pursuits while imprisoned. The poet Charles d'Orléans spent years imprisoned in England after being captured at the Battle of Agincourt, and he wrote extensively during his captivity, producing some of his best work. Physical restraints were rarely used on noble prisoners unless they were considered particularly dangerous. They weren't chained to walls or locked in leg irons. They could move around their quarters freely. In some cases, they were allowed to walk in courtyards or gardens under guard. A few noble prisoners were even allowed to leave the prison temporarily for hunting or other recreational activities, as long as they gave their word they'd return, which they usually did because breaking parole would ruin their honour and likely result in their execution. The reason for this differential treatment was partly practical and partly about maintaining social order. Noblemen were valuable. They could be ransomed, traded for other prisoners, or released when political circumstances changed. Keeping them alive and in good health preserved their value. Additionally, the medieval worldview held that people of different classes were fundamentally different types of beings. A nobleman was believed to have been born to nobility because of divine will and superior qualities. Treating them like common criminals would offend the social order itself. But below the nobles, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Wealthy merchants or professionals who'd committed crimes or been accused of fraud might be able to buy better conditions, but they'd never receive noble treatment. They'd be in smaller, less comfortable rooms. Their food would be better than what the poor received, but nothing compared to noble fare. They might be able to avoid the worst cells, but couldn't escape the prison environment entirely. Then there were the common prisoners, which meant the vast majority of people imprisoned. If you were a peasant, labourer, servant, or anyone without substantial means, you went to the common side. This was the nightmare we've been describing in previous sections. Crowded cells, no furniture, bare stone or earth floors, chains and shackles, minimal food, no medical care, and disease everywhere. The division between paying and non-paying prisoners was stark. At Newgate, for example, there were completely separate sections. The master's side, for those who could pay, had individual or semi-private cells. Prisoners there paid for everything: their room, their food, their bedding, even the removal of their chains if they'd been placed in irons. The fees were substantial and ongoing. You didn't just pay once, you paid weekly or monthly rents for your cell. You paid for every meal, every service, every slight improvement to your conditions. The common side was for those who couldn't pay. Dozens of prisoners would be packed into large communal rooms. There was no privacy, no comfort, no services. You slept on the floor, ate whatever minimal rations were provided, and hoped you'd survive long enough to be tried or released. The mortality rate on the common side was exponentially higher than on the master's side. Debtors' prisons created a particularly cruel situation. If you couldn't pay your debts, you'd be imprisoned until you paid them. But while imprisoned, you couldn't work to earn money to pay the debts. And if you had no family or friends to support you, you'd starve. The only way out was for someone on the outside to pay your debts for you. If no one did, you'd simply die in prison. Some debtors spent decades imprisoned, growing old behind bars for debts that might have originally been quite small. The system encouraged extortion and corruption at every level. Jailers made their living by charging prisoners for everything. There were fees for being admitted to prison, fees for being released, fees for having your chains removed or lightened, fees for better food, fees for visitors, fees for almost anything you could imagine. Jailers who were corrupt, which was most of them, would invent additional fees and penalties. If you couldn't or wouldn't pay, they'd make your life even more miserable. Some jailers ran protection rackets within their own prisons. They'd deliberately place a prisoner in a cell with violent inmates, then offer to move them to a safer cell for a fee. Or they'd threaten to reduce your food rations unless you paid extra. Or they'd steal whatever possessions you had when you arrived and sell them back to you. Women prisoners faced additional exploitation. Female prisoners were kept in separate areas, but were still under the control of male jailers. Sexual assault and rape were common. Women who had no money might be forced to provide sexual favours to jailers or other prison staff in exchange for better treatment, more food, or protection from other prisoners. Pregnancy in prison was a death sentence for both mother and child, with no medical care available for childbirth and no way to care for an infant in such conditions. Children could be imprisoned alongside adults, though some prisons attempted to keep them separate. Children of imprisoned debtors might be forced to live in prison with their parents, growing up in those horrible conditions. Young people accused of theft or other crimes would be thrown into cells with hardened adult criminals. There was no concept of juvenile justice or special consideration for youth. Political prisoners occupied a strange position in the hierarchy. If they were of noble birth, they'd receive noble treatment. But common people imprisoned for political crimes, such as rebellion or sedition, might actually be treated worse than ordinary criminals. Authorities wanted to make examples of them, so they'd be subjected to harsher conditions, more frequent torture, and fewer privileges. Religious prisoners also varied widely in their treatment. High-ranking clergy might be kept in relative comfort, while common people accused of heresy would be thrown into the worst cells and subjected to torture to extract confessions. During periods of religious persecution, the prisons would fill with people whose only crime was believing the wrong thing, and they'd be treated as enemies of both the state and God. The concept of prison reform didn't really exist in the medieval period, but occasionally someone with power and conscience would try to improve conditions. Richard Whittington's bequest to rebuild Newgate was one example. Some religious orders would visit prisons to provide charity to prisoners, bringing food or blankets. But these efforts were rare and made little overall difference to the system. Foreign prisoners, particularly those captured during wars, were treated as property. They'd be held for ransom, and their conditions would depend on their value. High-ranking military prisoners might live quite well, knowing they'd eventually be ransomed and returned home. Common soldiers captured in battle might be worked as slave labour, or simply left to die if they had no ransom value. The class system within prisons sometimes led to violence. Poor prisoners might attack wealthier ones, attempting to steal whatever money or possessions they had. Groups would form along class or ethnic lines, creating factions that fought for control of communal spaces. Jailers generally did nothing to stop this violence unless it threatened to spread outside the prison or somehow interfered with their ability to extract fees from prisoners. We need to confront one of the darkest aspects of medieval prisons, the deliberate infliction of pain to extract confessions or information. Torture wasn't a rare occurrence or an aberration. It was built into the medieval justice system, accepted as a legitimate means of discovering truth. Let's examine what torture actually looked like in medieval prisons, and why it was considered not just acceptable but necessary. The medieval worldview on torture was based on several beliefs. First, authorities believed that a person being tortured couldn't lie. The pain would force truth from them. This belief was completely wrong, of course. People being tortured will say whatever they think will make the pain stop, true or not. But medieval legal systems didn't understand this. Second, confessions obtained through torture were considered valid and legally binding. A person who confessed under torture could be convicted and executed based on that confession alone. Not everyone could be tortured legally. The rules varied by location and time period, but generally, torture was used primarily on common people accused of serious crimes. Nobles had more legal protections and often couldn't be tortured, except in cases of high treason. But for everyone else, if you were accused of murder, theft, heresy, witchcraft, or any other major crime, torture was likely if you didn't confess voluntarily. The process usually began with interrogation in normal cells. You'd be questioned about your alleged crime, and if you denied involvement, the questioning would become more aggressive. But if you continued to deny guilt, you'd be moved to the torture chamber. Sometimes, merely showing a prisoner the torture chamber and the instruments within it would be enough to produce a confession. The anticipation of pain, the psychological impact of seeing the devices that would be used on you, broke many people before the torture even began. The rack was perhaps the most infamous torture device in medieval prisons. It consisted of a wooden frame with rollers at each end. The victim would be laid flat on the rack, their wrists and ankles bound to the rollers. The torturer would then turn the rollers, slowly stretching the victim's body. The pain started gradually, a pulling sensation in your limbs. But as the stretching continued, your joints would begin to separate. You'd hear and feel your shoulders dislocating with loud pops. Your hips, elbows and knees would separate. The pain was excruciating and victims often passed out. If the torture continued, limbs could be torn off completely. Even if you survived, you'd often be permanently crippled, unable to walk or use your arms properly ever again. The Tower of London had a famous rack, and many high-profile prisoners were tortured on it. Guy Fawkes, involved in the gunpowder plot to blow up Parliament, was racked until he confessed. His signature on his confession was barely legible because his arms had been so damaged. Anne Askew, convicted of heresy, was racked so severely that she had to be carried to her execution because she couldn't walk. Strappado was another common torture method. The victim's hands would be tied behind their back, and they'd be hoisted into the air by a rope attached to their wrists. This put tremendous strain on the shoulders. The torturer could make it worse by suddenly dropping the victim part way and catching them with a jerk, which would dislocate both shoulders simultaneously. Weights might be attached to the victim's feet to increase the pulling force. Like the rack, Strappado could cause permanent injury even if the victim survived. Thumbscrews were simpler, but no less painful. Metal screws would be tightened around the victim's thumbs or fingers, crushing them slowly. The small bones in the fingers would break. The pain was intense, and since hands are so sensitive, even a little pressure caused agony. Similar devices existed for toes, and the effects were the same. The Judas cradle, also called the Judas chair, was particularly cruel. The victim would be suspended above a pyramid-shaped wooden or metal seat and slowly lowered onto it, with the point entering the anus or vagina. The weight of the victim's body would push them down onto the point, causing tearing and internal injuries. The torture could last for hours or days, with the victim repeatedly lifted and lowered. Infections from the wounds were common and often fatal. The iron boot was designed to crush the legs and feet. The victim's leg would be placed in a metal boot, and wedges would be hammered between the boot and the leg, each blow crushing the foot or shin. The bones would break, often in multiple places. Victims who survived might never walk again. Breaking wheels were used both for torture and execution. The victim would be tied to a large wheel, and then their limbs would be broken methodically with iron bars, shattering bones in the arms and legs. If this was torture rather than execution, the victim would be kept alive and forced to confess before being allowed to die. If it was execution, they'd eventually be left on the wheel to die from their injuries, which could take days. Burning was used in several ways. Red-hot irons could be applied to the skin, leaving horrible burns. The soles of feet were common targets because the pain receptors there are so dense. Or victims might be slowly roasted over fires, held close enough to be burned but not close enough to die quickly. The Spanish Inquisition was particularly fond of using fire as torture. Water torture took different forms. One version involved forcing large amounts of water down the victim's throat until their stomach distended painfully. Another version involved near drowning, submerging the victim's head in water until they nearly suffocated, then pulling them out just before death, over and over. Rats were sometimes used as instruments of torture. A cage containing a starving rat would be placed on the victim's stomach, and then heat would be applied to the cage. The rat, desperate to escape the heat, would claw and chew through the victim's abdomen to get away, burrowing into their intestines. The pear of anguish was an instrument shaped like a pear that could expand. It would be inserted into the victim's mouth, anus, or vagina, and then a screw would be turned to force the petals of the device apart, tearing whatever orifice it was in. This torture left horrible injuries that would often become infected. Psychological torture was also employed. Prisoners might be kept in total darkness for weeks or months, never knowing if it was day or night. Or they might be placed in tiny cells where they couldn't stand, sit, or lie down properly, forced to remain in agonizing positions for days. Sleep deprivation was common, with prisoners being kept awake through noise, light, or physical abuse for days on end until they became delirious. The torture session itself would be carefully managed. The goal was to cause maximum pain while keeping the victim alive and conscious enough to confess. Torturers were often skilled at judging how much a body could endure. They'd know when to stop before causing death or unconsciousness. They'd allow rest periods between torture sessions, just long enough for the victim to recover slightly before beginning again. Confessions extracted through torture followed a specific process. Once you confessed, you'd be taken back to a regular cell and asked to confirm your confession. If you recanted, you'd be tortured again. This cycle could continue until you provided a confession that satisfied the authorities and agreed to maintain it without further torture. Even then, you weren't safe. If your confession implicated others, they'd be arrested and tortured, and if their confessions contradicted yours, you might be tortured again to resolve the inconsistency. The church played a complicated role in medieval torture. Technically, clergy were forbidden from shedding blood, which meant they couldn't perform torture themselves. So religious courts, like those of the Inquisition, would hand prisoners over to secular authorities for torture. But the church would be intimately involved in the interrogation, with priests and inquisitors present during torture sessions, asking questions and determining what confessions were adequate. This legal fiction allowed the church to extract confessions through torture, while technically keeping their hands clean. Women accused of witchcraft face specific tortures. They might be subjected to sexual torture, their breasts crushed or torn with devices designed for that purpose. The belief that witches had a mark on their body where they'd pledged themselves to the devil led to their entire bodies being examined, often painfully, searching for such marks. Any unusual birthmark, mole, or scar might be declared a devil's mark, providing proof of witchcraft. Children weren't exempt from torture. Young people accused of crimes or witchcraft could be tortured, though usually with slightly less severity than adults. But the psychological impact of torture on children was if anything worse than on adults, and children who survived torture often developed severe mental problems. The aftermath of torture was often as bad as the torture itself. Broken bones were not set properly, dislocated joints were left dislocated, wounds were not treated or bandaged, infections set in quickly, and many torture victims died days or weeks after their sessions from sepsis or gangrene. Those who survived often had permanent disabilities, hands that no longer worked, legs that couldn't bear weight, faces scarred by burns. The torture left its mark on both body and mind. Even prisoners who weren't tortured lived in fear of it. You'd hear the screams of others being tortured. You'd see people being taken to the torture chamber and brought back broken. The fear was a constant presence, gnawing at your mind, making it hard to sleep or think. Some prisoners confessed to crimes they didn't commit simply to avoid being tortured. even though they knew confessing meant execution. Physical restraints in medieval prisons were universal and brutal. Almost every prisoner, regardless of their status or crime, would experience being chained, shackled, or bound in some way during their imprisonment. These restraints weren't just about preventing escape, they were instruments of punishment and control designed to cause discomfort, pain, and eventually permanent damage to the body. Let's start with the most common restraint: iron shackles around the wrists or ankles. These weren't smooth, well-made items. They were rough, heavy pieces of iron, often with sharp edges or protrusions. They'd be hammered closed around your limbs, tight enough that you couldn't slip them off, but sometimes so tight they'd cut off circulation. The weight alone was significant. A pair of leg irons might weigh 20 to 30 pounds. Wrist irons added another 10 to 15 pounds. This weight hung from your limbs constantly, pulling at your joints, making every movement laboured. The iron would rub against your skin with every motion. At first it would just be uncomfortable, a constant pressure and friction. But within hours or days the skin would start to wear away. You'd develop raw, painful spots where the metal rubbed. These would progress to open wounds, bleeding and oozing. The unsanitary conditions meant these wounds would become infected. Pus would form, mixing with the blood and the rust from the chains. The smell would add to the general stench of the prison, and the wounds would never have a chance to heal because the chains stayed on, continuing to rub and damage the skin. Chains connected your shackles to rings embedded in the walls. The chains varied in length, but they were never long enough for comfort. You might have 3 or 4 feet of chain, letting you stand up, sit down, or lie down, but not giving you any real freedom of movement. You couldn't pace, you couldn't stretch properly, you couldn't move away from other chained prisoners if you were in a communal cell. The chain would constantly remind you of your confinement, the weight and restriction, a physical manifestation of your captivity. Some prisoners were chained in positions designed to cause maximum discomfort. You might be chained with your arms above your head, forcing you to stand on your toes or hang partially suspended. This position causes excruciating pain in the shoulders and arms within hours. Your muscles would cramp, your circulation would be restricted. If you were left like this for days or weeks, permanent damage would result. Your shoulders might dislocate, your hands might lose function from nerve damage. Other prisoners were chained in sitting or kneeling positions that they couldn't escape from. You'd be forced to hold that position constantly, unable to stand or lie down. Your joints would stiffen, your muscles would atrophy. Bed sores would develop where your body pressed against the floor or wall. These sores would become deep wounds, exposing bone in severe cases. Neck irons, also called collars, were used for prisoners considered particularly dangerous or difficult. A heavy iron collar would be locked around your neck, sometimes with additional chains connecting it to a wall or to your wrist or ankle shackles. The weight of the collar would press down on your collarbones and shoulders. Moving your head became difficult. The collar would rub against your neck, causing wounds similar to those from wrist and ankle shackles. Some collars had internal spikes or sharp edges that would dig into your skin if you moved wrong or tried to lie down. These were designed to force you to stay in specific positions or to prevent you from sleeping comfortably. The psychological impact was significant. Constant attention to how you moved or positioned yourself, knowing that any mistake would cause fresh pain. Manacles, sometimes called handcuffs though they weren't always attached to each other, were iron cuffs for the wrists. These could be connected by a short chain, forcing your hands together, or they could be separate, allowing individual wrists to be chained to different points. When chained separately, your arms might be spread wide, pulled in opposite directions, making it impossible to feed yourself or perform any normal activities. Ball and chain, the iconic image of medieval imprisonment, was very real. A heavy iron ball, perhaps 20 to 50 pounds, would be chained to a prisoner's ankle. You'd have to drag this weight everywhere you went. Walking became exhausting. Running was impossible. The ball would catch on things, trip you, and constantly pull at your leg. Over time, the leg bearing the ball would develop problems, the joints would become damaged, the muscles would be overworked on one side and underused on the other, creating imbalances that would persist even if the ball was eventually removed. For the worst offenders or the most feared prisoners, multiple restraints would be combined. You might have wrist irons, leg irons, and a collar, all connected by chains. Or you might be placed in a larger framework that restricted movement even more comprehensively. The Scavenger's Daughter, used primarily in the Tower of London, was a metal frame that compressed the body, forcing the knees up to the chest and the arms down, creating a painful contorted position that would cause extreme discomfort within minutes and potential injury if maintained for hours. The gibbet cage, while primarily used for execution and display of bodies, was sometimes used to confine living prisoners. You'd be placed in a human-shaped metal cage barely large enough to contain you, unable to move or shift position. The cage might be suspended in the air or placed in a cell, but either way, you were trapped in a position you couldn't change, your body slowly cramping and seizing up. Children and smaller adults sometimes faced an additional cruelty. The shackles and chains were made to fit adult men, which meant they might be too large for smaller prisoners. To keep the shackles from simply sliding off, additional painful measures would be used. The shackles might be hammered smaller, crushing the limbs in the process, or rope might be tied tightly around the limbs beneath the shackles to prevent them from sliding, cutting, off circulation and causing its own damage. The sound of chains was omnipresent in medieval prisons. Every movement made noise. When you shifted position, chains rattled. When other prisoners moved, you'd hear their chains. The constant background noise of metal scraping and clanking would fill the air, a reminder of captivity that you could never escape. Removing chains was itself a painful process. If you were going to be released or moved, the chains had to come off, but they'd been on for so long that your body had adapted to them. When the weight was suddenly removed, your limbs would feel strange, almost weightless. The wounds where the chains had been would be exposed, raw and infected, and if circulation had been restricted, the sudden return of blood flow would cause intense pain as damaged nerves reawakened. Some prisoners were never unchained during their entire imprisonment. They'd be shackled on arrival and remain that way until death or release. Years might pass with the same chains in place. The wounds around the shackles would become chronic, never healing, just forming thick calluses of scar tissue. The prisoner's body would adapt as much as it could, but the damage was permanent. The psychological impact of constant restraint was profound. The inability to move freely, to scratch an itch, to adjust your position when uncomfortable, created a level of frustration and helplessness that wore away at your sanity. You'd become obsessed with the chains, constantly aware of them, unable to think about anything else. Sleep became difficult because every position was uncomfortable, and any movement would cause the chains to pull or rub. Restraints also affected other aspects of prison life. Eating was difficult with chained hands. You might have to bend down to a bowl on the floor like an animal, unable to lift it or use utensils properly. Using whatever toilet facilities existed was complicated by restraints. Defending yourself from other prisoners was nearly impossible if you were heavily chained and they weren't. The deliberate humiliation aspect of chains shouldn't be underestimated. Authorities wanted prisoners to feel degraded, reduced from humans to things that needed to be restrained. The chains were visible proof of your fall from society. When prisoners were moved through public areas or taken to court, the chains would be on display, showing everyone that this was a criminal, someone dangerous who needed to be bound. Among all the nightmares of medieval imprisonment, the oubliette stands out as perhaps the most purely horrific. The name itself comes from the French word oublier, which means to forget, and that was exactly the purpose of these terrible spaces. Let's explore these chambers of oblivion and understand why being thrown into an oubliette was a fate worse than most executions. An oubliette wasn't a normal cell. It was a vertical shaft, typically only accessible through a trapdoor in the ceiling. The shaft would be narrow, often just wide enough for a person to be lowered down. At the bottom, the space might widen slightly, but not by much. The dimensions were claustrophobic in the extreme. You couldn't lie down properly. In some oubliettes, you couldn't sit either. You'd be forced to stand, or at best crouch in an agonising position, for however long you remained there. The entrance was the only opening. No windows, no ventilation shafts, no doors. Once the trapdoor closed above you, you were sealed in total darkness. Not the darkness of a windowless dungeon cell, which might at least have occasional light from a jailer's torch, but absolute, unbroken, eternal darkness. Your eyes would strain and adapt, but there was nothing to adapt to. No matter how long you stayed, you'd never see anything. You could wave your hand in front of your face and see nothing. You could open your eyes or close them and detect no difference. The air in an oubliette was stale and limited. Without ventilation, the oxygen would slowly be depleted by your breathing. You'd feel it as the hours passed, your breathing becoming more laboured, your head growing foggy and dizzy. The carbon dioxide would build up, creating a thick, oppressive atmosphere. Some prisoners would pass out from oxygen deprivation, only to wake up when the air had cleared slightly, beginning the cycle again. Food and water, if they were provided at all, would be dropped down through the trapdoor. You'd hear it coming, a moment of sound in the silence, and then whatever had been thrown would land somewhere in your tiny space. Finding it in the complete darkness meant feeling around on the floor with your hands, groping blindly, hoping the rats hadn't gotten to it first. The floor was usually covered in your own waste, old food scraps and debris, making the search disgusting as well as difficult. The acoustics of an oubliette were designed to maximise psychological torment. The narrow shaft would amplify and echo sounds. Your own voice, if you tried to call out, would bounce back at you, distorted and strange. Your breathing would echo. Every scrape and shuffle would be magnified. But sounds from outside, from above, would be muffled and distant. You might hear footsteps above you, voices, the sounds of life continuing, but all as if from another world. You'd call out, scream for help, bang on the walls, but it would make no difference. The oubliette was designed to muffle such sounds so they wouldn't disturb anyone above. The temperature in an oubliette varied depending on its location, but it was always uncomfortable. If the shaft was below ground, which most were, it would be perpetually cold and damp. Water would seep through the walls, collecting at the bottom where you stood or crouched. Your feet would be constantly wet, leading to trench foot and infections. In summer, the cold might be bearable, but in winter it would be brutal. Without any source of heat, you'd slowly freeze, the dampness making it worse. Time lost all meaning in an oubliette. With no light, no way to tell day from night, and no regular schedule of activities, your circadian rhythm would break down completely. You might be awake for what felt like days, unable to sleep in the uncomfortable position, the cold and the fear. Or you might sleep frequently, unable to distinguish sleep from waking in the darkness. Days, weeks, and months would blur together. Prisoners who were eventually removed from oubliettes, if they were lucky enough to be removed, often had no idea how long they'd been down there. The isolation was absolute and crushing. No human contact, no conversation, no interaction of any kind. You were alone with your thoughts in the darkness, and those thoughts would eventually turn against you. The mind needs stimulation, input from the outside world, to function properly. Denied this, you'd begin to hallucinate. You'd hear voices that weren't there. You'd see lights and shapes in the darkness. Your mind would create company to fight the loneliness, but these hallucinations weren't comforting. They'd be disturbing, frightening, adding to the psychological breakdown. Some prisoners in oubliettes would talk to themselves, creating imaginary conversations just to hear a voice. Others would sing, tell themselves stories, or recite prayers, anything to break the silence. But over time, even these coping mechanisms would fail. The darkness and isolation would break your mind. You'd descend into madness, no longer able to think clearly or rationally. The physical deterioration in an oubliette was rapid and severe. The forced standing or crouching position would destroy your joints and spine. Your legs would swell from lack of movement and poor circulation. The muscles in your legs, back and neck would be in constant tension, leading to chronic pain and eventual permanent damage. Your bones would begin to deform from the constant pressure in the same position. If you were tall and the oubliette was short, you might be forced to stand bent over, unable to straighten up for weeks or months. The damage would be irreversible. Malnutrition progressed quickly because the minimal food provided was never enough, and sometimes it wasn't provided at all. The person dropping food through the trapdoor might forget, or might deliberately withhold food as additional punishment. Days could pass between feedings. Your body would begin consuming itself. Combined with the other stresses, this meant rapid deterioration of health. Disease was even more dangerous in an oubliette than in regular prison cells. The dampness and cold made respiratory infections almost certain. Pneumonia was common. The complete darkness and malnutrition weakened your immune system, and if you became seriously ill, there was no help. You'd suffer through fevers, chills, and delirium alone in the dark with no medicine, no comfort, and no hope of recovery. Some oubliettes had additional refinements of cruelty. Sharp stones might cover the floor, making it painful to stand or sit. The walls might be lined with rough surfaces that would scrape your skin if you leaned against them. Some had water at the bottom, forcing you to stand in cold water constantly. The water might be several inches or even feet deep, making it impossible to sit or lie down without drowning. The worst aspect of an oubliette was the hopelessness. In a regular cell, no matter how terrible, you might hope for release, for trial, for some kind of resolution, but the oubliette was designed to remove hope. You'd been dropped into this hole to be forgotten. No one was coming, no one cared. You'd been removed from the world, erased from existence while still alive. This psychological impact, the absolute certainty that you'd been abandoned, broke people faster than the physical suffering. Specific historical oubliettes became infamous. At Leap Castle in Ireland, the oubliette was discovered to contain dozens of skeletons, the remains of people who'd been dropped in and forgotten over the years. The castle's history suggests that the oubliette was used not just for imprisonment, but as a method of disposal. People who were politically inconvenient would simply vanish down the shaft, and the problem was solved. Warwick Castle in England had an oubliette with a floor covered in sharp, jagged stones. Anyone dropped into it would be injured immediately by the stones, and any movement would cause additional cuts. The stones ensured that even if food and water were provided, the prisoner would be in constant agony, unable to rest or find any comfortable position. The oubliette at Chillingham Castle gained a reputation for being haunted, with visitors reporting feeling overwhelming sadness and seeing apparitions. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the psychological imprint of what happened in that space is undeniable. The suffering that occurred there was so intense that it seems to have left a mark on the place itself. Pembroke Castle and Conwy Castle in Wales both had oubliettes where prisoners were kept in darkness for extended periods. Records suggest that many prisoners in these oubliettes died within weeks, unable to survive the combination of cold, damp, isolation and starvation. In France, the Bastille had oubliettes beneath the regular prison cells. These were used for prisoners who'd become troublesome in the normal cells or whom the authorities wanted to punish more severely. Being moved from a cell to the oubliette was a terrifying transition, a descent into a deeper hell. Some accounts describe oubliettes that were little more than pits where waste from higher levels of the castle would drain. Prisoners in these would be standing in sewage surrounded by filth, breathing foul air, slowly dying from infection and disease. This wasn't accidental, it was deliberate, a way to make the imprisonment even more degrading and painful. The concept of the oubliette spread beyond just physical spaces. The term came to represent any situation where someone was abandoned and forgotten, but the real, physical oubliettes were concrete manifestations of humanity's capacity for cruelty. They served no rehabilitative purpose, no deterrent value. They existed purely to inflict maximum suffering on the prisoner while removing them completely from society and memory. Understanding why people ended up in medieval prisons requires examining the medieval justice system, which was fundamentally different from modern legal principles. The concept of innocent until proven guilty didn't exist. Neither did the right to a lawyer, the right to remain silent, or most of the legal protections we take for granted today. Let's explore how justice, or more accurately injustice, determined who ended up in these nightmarish prisons. First, imprisonment itself wasn't usually the sentence. Medieval justice focused on physical punishments and executions. If you were convicted of a crime, you'd likely be hanged, beheaded, flogged, mutilated, or branded. Prison was primarily where you waited, either for your trial or for your execution. The exception was debtors, who'd be imprisoned until they paid their debts, and political prisoners, who might be held indefinitely while situations resolved. Trials were nothing like modern proceedings. There were no forensic investigations, no detailed evidence collection, and often no witnesses in the modern sense. Accusations were often enough to lead to imprisonment. If someone of higher social standing accused you of a crime, you'd likely be arrested and imprisoned immediately. The accusation itself was treated as strong evidence, and the burden was on you to prove your innocence, not on the accuser to prove your guilt. Trial by ordeal was still used in some places during the early medieval period. This was based on the belief that God would reveal guilt or innocence through supernatural means. You might be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar for several steps. If your hand healed without infection within 3 days, you were innocent. If it became infected, you were guilty, or you might be thrown into water. If you sank, you were innocent because the pure water accepted you. If you floated, you were guilty because the water rejected you. Of course, if you sank, you might drown before being pulled out, and if you floated, you'd be executed anyway, so neither outcome was great. By the later medieval period, trial by ordeal was officially ended by the Church, but other forms of proof were equally problematic. Confession was the gold standard of evidence, which explains why torture was so common. If you confessed, whether voluntarily or under torture, that confession was usually sufficient for conviction. The fact that torture would make someone confess to anything didn't matter. The medieval mindset believed that God would prevent an innocent person from confessing even under torture, so any confession must be true. Many people imprisoned were there on suspicion alone. If a crime occurred, authorities might round up anyone who seemed suspicious. If you were a stranger in town, if you were known to associate with criminals, if you'd had a previous conviction, or if someone simply didn't like you and named you as a suspect, you could be thrown into prison while the authorities figured out what to do with you. This investigation might take weeks, months, or years. You'd be rotting in a cell the entire time, presumed guilty, waiting for a trial that might never come. The trial itself, when it finally happened, was usually quick. At Newgate, trials at the adjacent Old Bailey courthouse averaged about 30 minutes each. This included time for the charges to be read, the accused to speak, any witnesses to testify, and the verdict to be delivered. With dozens or hundreds of prisoners awaiting trial, spending more than a few minutes on each case was impractical. The accused often had no chance to prepare a defence, didn't know who was testifying against them, and couldn't cross-examine witnesses. Class and social connections mattered enormously. If you were wealthy or had powerful friends, you might never see the inside of a prison at all. Your case would be handled differently, possibly through payment of fines or through intervention by your influential contacts. But if you were poor, friendless, or socially marginal, you'd face the full brutality of the system. Certain crimes led almost automatically to imprisonment and execution. Murder, of course, but also many forms of theft. The threshold for a capital crime was surprisingly low. Stealing items worth more than a shilling could be a hanging offence. Poaching, hunting deer or rabbits on land belonging to a noble could lead to imprisonment and severe punishment. During certain periods, poaching was punished by blinding or castration. though eventually it was downgraded to imprisonment and fines. Heresy, the crime of holding religious beliefs that differed from Orthodox Christianity, was one of the most severely punished offences. During the various inquisitions, people accused of heresy would be imprisoned, interrogated under torture, and if they didn't recant their beliefs, they'd be burned alive. Even if you did recant, you might still face continued imprisonment. The Spanish Inquisition in particular was notorious for its brutal treatment of prisoners accused of heresy. Witchcraft accusations could land anyone in prison, but women were particularly vulnerable. The evidence required to accuse someone of witchcraft was ludicrously flimsy. A neighbour's cow dies after you walked past. Witchcraft. A child falls ill after you looked at them. Witchcraft. Someone has a dream about you doing something evil. Witchcraft. Once accused, you'd be imprisoned, probably tortured to extract a confession, and then likely executed. The famous witch trials, while they peaked in the early modern period after the medieval era proper, had their roots in medieval attitudes toward magic and the supernatural. Political crimes cast a wide net. Speaking against the king, supporting the wrong faction in a power struggle, or even being related to someone who'd fallen from favour could lead to imprisonment. Political prisoners often faced the worst conditions because authorities wanted to break them completely. If you weren't executed immediately, you might be held for years, your fate depending on shifting political winds. False accusations were common and could destroy lives. If someone wanted to harm you, they could accuse you of a crime. The accusation alone would lead to your imprisonment. Even if you were eventually acquitted, you'd have spent time in prison, potentially losing your health, your livelihood, and your reputation. An acquittal wasn't guaranteed. If the person accusing you was of higher social standing, their word would typically be believed over yours. Debt was a unique category. You couldn't be imprisoned for being poor, but you could be imprisoned for owing money. The distinction was important legally, but meant nothing to the person locked up. If you borrowed money and couldn't repay it, if you bought goods on credit and couldn't pay, or if you had any kind of financial obligation you couldn't meet, you could be imprisoned. The debt might be quite small, but once imprisoned you couldn't work to earn money to pay it off. You were stuck until someone, usually a family member, paid the debt for you. Women faced particular injustices in the medieval legal system. They had few legal rights, and often couldn't testify in their own defence effectively. A woman accused of adultery might be imprisoned, even though male adultery was rarely punished. Women who were outspoken, independent, or didn't conform to expected gender roles were more likely to face accusations of various crimes, particularly witchcraft. And once imprisoned, women faced sexual exploitation from jailers and guards with no legal recourse. Children could be imprisoned for crimes, though the age of criminal responsibility varied. A child of 7 or 8 might be imprisoned for theft and potentially executed, treated exactly the same as an adult criminal. There was no concept of juvenile justice or special consideration for youth. If you committed a crime, you faced adult consequences, regardless of your age or understanding of what you'd done. The duration of imprisonment before trial was entirely unpredictable. You might be held for a few days, or you might be held for years. There was no requirement that you be tried within any particular time frame. If the authorities were busy, if witnesses weren't available, if records were lost, or if they simply forgot about you, you'd continue rotting in your cell. Some prisoners died before ever being tried, their guilt or innocence never determined. Once convicted, the execution of your sentence could be delayed for various reasons. If you were sentenced to death but the executioner was unavailable, you'd wait in prison. If authorities wanted to execute multiple prisoners at once for a more impressive public spectacle, you'd wait until they had enough condemned prisoners. If it was a holy day when executions weren't performed, you'd wait until the next appropriate day. All this waiting happened in prison, in chains, in terrible conditions. Pardons and commutations did occur but were unpredictable and often political. A monarch might declare a general pardon for certain crimes on their coronation, or another special occasion. If you were lucky enough to be imprisoned during such an event and your crime qualified, you might be released. But this was rare, and not something you could count on. Most prisoners served their full time or died trying. The injustice of the medieval system was systemic and intentional. The wealthy and powerful designed and operated a system that protected their interests and controlled the lower classes through fear. Prison was a tool of social control as much as a place of punishment. The horrific conditions weren't accidental. They were features of a system that viewed most people as disposable and valued property rights over human rights. Despite the seemingly hopeless situation, prisoners did attempt to escape, and a few even succeeded. But escape from a medieval prison required extraordinary luck, outside help, or both. Let's look at how prisoners attempted to break free, and how those who remained tried to maintain their sanity and survive. Physical escape from a medieval prison was extremely difficult. The architecture was designed specifically to prevent it. Thick stone walls, narrow windows with iron bars if there were windows at all, heavy doors with massive locks, and often multiple layers of security between the prisoner and freedom. Underground dungeons were particularly impossible to escape from. You couldn't dig through solid rock with your bare hands, and even if you somehow had tools, where would you dig to? You didn't know the layout of the castle above you or which direction would lead to freedom rather than another wall. Nevertheless, prisoners tried. Some attempted to dig through walls, using anything they could find as tools. A piece of broken stone might be used to slowly chip away at mortar between blocks. This would take weeks or months of patient, secret work, usually done at night when jailers weren't around. The stone dust would have to be hidden, either by mixing it with the dirt floor or finding some other way to dispose of it. And if you succeeded in creating a hole through the wall, you'd likely just find yourself in another part of the prison rather than outside. Picking locks was another method attempted, though most prisoners lacked the skills or tools. A piece of wire or metal, if you could somehow obtain one, might be fashioned into a primitive lockpick, but medieval locks were often more about brute strength than precision mechanisms. Breaking a lock would require leverage and force, which would make noise and draw attention. Some escape attempts involved violence against guards or jailers. When a guard entered a cell to deliver food or remove a body, a prisoner or group of prisoners might attack, trying to overpower them, steal their keys, and flee. These attempts rarely succeeded. Guards were armed and prisoners weren't. Even if you managed to overpower one guard, there would be others between you and freedom. And if the attempt failed, punishment would be severe, probably torture and immediate execution. The most successful escapes usually involved outside help. Family or friends might bribe guards to look the other way or to provide tools. A sympathetic guard might be persuaded through money, threats, or ideology to help. In cases of noble prisoners, sometimes their supporters would mount a full-scale assault on the prison, using force to break them out. But this required significant resources and planning, and it elevated the escape from a prison break to an act of rebellion against the authorities. One famous escape was by John II of France, though technically he didn't escape so much as persuade his captors to give him temporary freedom. After being captured by the English, he was imprisoned in the Tower of London, but he was treated as a noble guest rather than a prisoner, and eventually he was allowed to return to France on his word of honour to come back or send a replacement. When his son, who'd been sent as the replacement, escaped, John voluntarily returned to captivity in England because he'd given his word. He died in captivity, but his honour remained intact, which to a medieval nobleman was worth more than life. Jack Sheppard, a thief in the early 1700s, escaped from Newgate Prison twice, becoming a folk hero. His escapes involved picking locks, removing his chains, and navigating through the prison to freedom. His methods inspired other prisoners to attempt similar escapes, though few had his skills or luck. Sheppard was eventually recaptured and hanged, but his legend persisted. For prisoners who couldn't or wouldn't attempt physical escape, psychological survival became the challenge. How do you maintain your sanity in conditions designed to destroy it? Different prisoners developed different coping mechanisms. Some turned to religion. Prayer gave structure to shapeless time. Reciting memorized prayers, psalms, or liturgies provided mental stimulation and comfort. For many medieval people, their faith was genuine and deep, and they believed that God would see them through their suffering. The promise of heaven after death gave meaning to their suffering and reason to endure. Some prisoners carved religious symbols or verses into the walls of their cells, physical manifestations of their faith. The walls of medieval prisons are covered with graffiti, much of it still visible today. Prisoners carved their names, the dates if they knew them, prayers, symbols and messages. The Beauchamp Tower in the Tower of London is particularly famous for its prisoner graffiti. The walls are covered with elaborate carvings, some quite beautiful, created by prisoners with time, sharp objects, and a desperate need to leave some mark on the world. Creating these carvings gave prisoners a sense of purpose, a project to focus on, something to do with the endless empty hours. Some graffiti tells stories. Prisoners would carve accounts of why they were imprisoned, their innocence or guilt, their thoughts about their situation. These carvings are poignant historical records, voices from the past speaking directly to us. My innocence is my only comfort, carved by a prisoner in one English prison. Remember death, carved by another, a reminder of mortality that was all too present in those cells. Social interaction, where possible, was crucial for survival. In communal cells, despite the horror of overcrowding, at least you had human contact. You could talk to other prisoners, share stories, provide comfort. Friendships formed in prison could be intense, forged in shared suffering. Groups of prisoners might watch out for each other, sharing food, protecting the weak from the strong, trying to maintain some sense of community and humanity. In isolation, prisoners would create imaginary companions, talk to themselves, or develop complex inner worlds to escape the external horror. Some would compose poems or stories in their minds, elaborate fantasies of freedom and revenge. Others would replay memories from their lives before prison, reliving happier times in their imagination. Physical exercise, even in extremely limited space, helped some prisoners maintain their health and sanity. If you could move at all, even just stretching or tensing muscles, it helped prevent complete physical deterioration. Prisoners who maintained some level of physical activity survived longer than those who simply gave up and lay down. Maintaining a routine, any routine, helped structure time. Perhaps you'd do a certain set of exercises at what you guessed was morning. You'd pray at specific times. You'd ration your food in a particular way. The content of the routine mattered less than having one. It gave you some sense of control, some way to mark time's passage, some structure in the chaos. Humour, dark and grim as it might be, was another survival mechanism. Prisoners would joke about their situation, mock their jailers, or find absurdity in their suffering. Gallows humour is called that for a reason. If you could laugh at death, at least you hadn't given death complete power over you. Some prisoners survived through anger. They'd nurture hatred for whoever had imprisoned them, fantasies of revenge and justice. This anger could be sustaining, giving them a reason to keep living, to survive so they could eventually have their revenge. Others survived through hope, however irrational. Hope that they'd be found innocent at trial, hope that a pardon would come, hope that someone would pay their debt or ransom, hope that the political situation would change in their favour. This hope might be completely unrealistic, but it kept them going when despair would have been fatal. Teaching and learning helped prisoners pass time and maintain mental function. If you knew how to read, you might teach others. If you knew a skill or trade, you'd share that knowledge. In some prisons, literate prisoners would read aloud to illiterate ones, sharing stories or religious texts. This not only helped pass time, but created social bonds and gave everyone involved a sense of purpose. Maintaining dignity in undignified circumstances was a form of resistance. You'd try to keep yourself as clean as possible despite the filth. You'd maintain patterns of behaviour that showed you were still human, still civilised. You'd use proper language, maintain courtesy with other prisoners, refuse to descend completely into the barbarism that the prison encouraged. But not everyone could maintain these coping strategies. Many prisoners did descend into madness, their minds broken by the conditions. Some became catatonic, withdrawing so completely that they'd no longer eat or respond to external stimuli. Others became violent, lashing out randomly at anyone nearby. Mental breakdown was common, and like physical illness was essentially untreatable. Suicide was attempted by some prisoners who couldn't bear the continuation of their suffering. Methods were limited but creative. Some starved themselves, refusing food until they died. Others tried to harm themselves with whatever sharp objects they could find or fashion. Hanging yourself was difficult without rope or a suitable beam, but some managed. Guards would sometimes prevent suicide attempts, not out of concern for the prisoner, but because the prisoner's death should be the state's decision, not the prisoner's own. For many prisoners, their time in jail ended only with death. Whether through disease, starvation or violence, or through formal execution, death was the most common exit from a medieval prison. Let's examine how prisoners met their ends and what happened in those final moments. Dying in your cell was common. Disease would take hold, and without any medical treatment you'd simply decline over days or weeks. Fever would burn through you. You'd become delirious, perhaps not even aware of where you were anymore. Other prisoners would watch you deteriorate, knowing they might be next. When you finally died, your body would be left where it fell until a jailer noticed and bothered to remove it. Other prisoners would be forced to remain in the cell with your corpse, sometimes for days. Bodies weren't treated with respect. You'd be dragged out of the cell by the ankles, your head bumping along the stone floor. If multiple prisoners had died, the bodies would be piled on a cart like cargo. They'd be taken for burial in a mass grave, usually outside the city walls in unconsecrated ground. No individual graves, no markers, no records kept of who was buried where. You'd simply disappear, forgotten by the world. For prisoners sentenced to death, the end came through public execution. This was theatre, spectacle and social control all combined. Executions were public events, and large crowds would gather to watch. The condemned would be led from the prison in procession, often through busy streets, giving people the chance to see them and mock them. At Newgate, condemned prisoners would be taken by cart to the gallows at Tyburn, located near modern-day Hyde Park Corner. The journey took about an hour, passing through crowded streets. People would line the route, some jeering, others silent, some selling food and souvenirs. The condemned prisoner would sit or stand in the cart, their hands bound, wearing whatever clothes they had, which by this point would be filthy rags. Some prisoners maintained dignity on this final journey. They'd hold their heads high, pray, or speak to the crowd. Others broke down, weeping or begging for mercy that wouldn't come. The crowd's reaction varied. Sometimes they were sympathetic, particularly if the prisoner was young, or if they felt the sentence was unjust. Other times they were hostile, throwing things or shouting insults. At the execution site, the prisoner would be given a chance to speak. This was the last dying speech, and some prisoners used it to confess their crimes, beg forgiveness, or warn others not to follow their path. Others proclaimed their innocence to the end. A few used it to make political statements or attacks on their enemies. The crowd would listen attentively to these speeches, which were sometimes printed and sold afterward as popular literature. Hanging was the most common execution method in England, but it wasn't the quick, relatively humane hanging of later centuries, where a calculated drop would break the neck instantly. Medieval hanging was slow strangulation. The prisoner would be placed in the cart with a noose around their neck. The rope would be thrown over a beam. Then the cart would be driven away, leaving the prisoner dangling. Death by strangulation took several minutes. You'd kick and struggle, your face turning purple, your tongue protruding, slowly choking to death while the crowd watched. Friends or family might pull on your legs to speed the process, trying to give you a quicker death. This was considered a mercy. Without this help, you could hang there struggling for 10 minutes or more before finally dying. Your body would remain hanging for a while afterward as a warning to others. Beheading was reserved for nobles. It was considered a more honourable form of execution. You'd kneel, place your head on a block, and the executioner would attempt to sever your head with a sword or axe. If the executioner was skilled and his blade was sharp, death would be quick, one blow severing the spinal cord. But if he was clumsy or the blade was dull, it might take multiple blows, each one causing excruciating pain until finally your neck was severed and you died. Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, was beheaded at the Tower of London. She was given the mercy of being executed by a skilled French swordsman rather than the standard executioner with an axe. Her execution was witnessed by a crowd. She made a short speech, was blindfolded, and then the swordsman struck off her head with a single blow. Her head and body were placed in an unmarked grave in the Tower's chapel. Burning was used primarily for heresy. Being burned at the stake was agonizing. You'd be tied to a wooden post with bundles of wood and brush piled around you. The fire would be lit and the flames would slowly grow, the heat becoming unbearable. Smoke inhalation might kill you before the flames reached you if you were lucky, but many victims remained conscious as the flames burned their legs and lower body. The screaming would be terrible. Some victims were given gunpowder wrapped in a bag and hung around their neck, which would explode when the flames reached it, providing a quicker death. Drawing and quartering was reserved for the crime of high treason. This was the most horrific execution method. The condemned would be hanged until nearly dead but cut down before actually dying. Then they'd be disemboweled while still alive, their intestines pulled out and burned before their eyes. Finally, they'd be beheaded, and their body cut into 4 quarters. The pieces would be displayed in different locations as a warning. Guy Fawkes faced this sentence after the gunpowder plot, though he managed to jump from the scaffold and break his neck, giving himself a quicker death before the full sentence could be carried out. Women convicted of treason could be burned rather than hanged, drawn and quartered, though this was still a horrible death. The logic was that the public dismemberment of a woman's body would be too indecent, so burning was substituted. After execution, the bodies or body parts would often be displayed. They might be hung in chains at a gibbet, a metal cage designed to hold a corpse. The body would remain there for weeks or months, slowly decomposing, picked at by birds, a warning to anyone who passed by. Alternatively, heads of executed traitors might be displayed on spikes on bridges or city gates. The heads would be boiled or tarred to preserve them longer. They'd remain there until they rotted and fell apart, sometimes years later. Not all deaths in prison came through execution. Murder by other prisoners was common, particularly in overcrowded communal cells. Disputes over food, space, or any other reason could turn violent. Without weapons, prisoners would use fists, feet, teeth, and whatever objects they could find. These fights would be vicious and often fatal. Guards rarely intervened unless the violence threatened to spread outside the immediate cell. Suicide, as mentioned earlier, was another possible end. The Church considered suicide a mortal sin, and the body of a suicide would be denied Christian burial. But for some prisoners, that spiritual risk seemed better than continued suffering. They'd find ways to end their lives despite the lack of obvious means. Some prisoners simply gave up and died. They'd stop eating, stop responding, and within days or weeks they'd be dead. This wasn't exactly suicide, as they weren't actively killing themselves, but it was a form of surrender, a decision that death was preferable to another day of existence in those conditions. For prisoners who survived and were eventually released, their ordeal didn't end at the prison door. They emerged into a world that had continued without them. Their health was usually destroyed. They'd lost weight, teeth, and often their sanity. Their families might have given them up for dead. Their jobs and homes were gone. The stigma of having been imprisoned followed them. Many former prisoners never recovered, dying within a year or 2 of release from complications of their imprisonment. But they were the lucky ones. They'd survived. They'd escaped the walls, the darkness, the disease, and the death that claimed so many others. They could see the sky again, breathe fresh air, sleep without chains, and live whatever life they could rebuild. For those who died inside, their suffering was finally over. Whether they died in a cell or on an executioner's block, whether they were buried in a mass grave or displayed as a warning, they were free from the nightmare of medieval imprisonment. Their bodies might be gone, but their stories remain, carved into prison walls, recorded in legal documents, passed down through history. They speak to us across the centuries, reminding us what humans are capable of inflicting on each other, and why such systems of injustice must never be allowed to exist again. So there you have it. An exploration of what medieval prison was really like, stripped of romanticism and historical distance. It was dark, cold, disease-ridden and cruel beyond measure. People were thrown into cells to rot, tortured to extract false confessions, chained until their bodies broke, and eventually killed either by disease or by execution. The entire system operated with a casual disregard for human life and dignity that's difficult for us to fully comprehend from our modern perspective. The medieval prison was designed not to reform or rehabilitate, but to punish, control, and terrify. It succeeded completely at all three. The very threat of imprisonment was enough to keep most people in line. Those unlucky enough to actually experience it rarely emerged unchanged. The physical and psychological damage was permanent. We've come far since those dark days. Modern prisons, for all their flaws, operate on principles of humanity and rehabilitation that would have been completely foreign to medieval jailers. We recognise prisoners as human beings with rights. We provide medical care, adequate food, sanitation, and at least the possibility of redemption. But the medieval prison stands as a reminder of what happens when justice becomes purely about punishment, when compassion is seen as weakness, and when some humans are deemed unworthy of basic dignity. The stones of those ancient dungeons still exist in many places, silent witnesses to centuries of suffering. Walking through them today, even as a tourist in bright sunlight, you can still feel the weight of that history, the echo of pain that's soaked into those walls. Next time you lie down in your warm bed, in a room with light and air and freedom, perhaps take a moment to appreciate what you have. Because for most of human history, for millions of people, the reality was far darker. Sweet dreams, everyone. And remember, the past was absolutely full of nightmares that we're incredibly fortunate to have escaped.